and everything was going great.
We're following the leader, the leader, the leader. We're following the leader wherever we may go.
For about the first 5 minutes.
Moses, why did you take us this way? The Red Sea is in front of us, blocking our escape. Pharaoh changed his mind and he's charging after us. I wish I were back in Egypt.
I wish I had never followed you.
I wish I were dead.
Enough whining! And so God allowed Moses to part the Red Sea, leading the Israelites through on dry ground. But the Egyptians were destroyed as the water filled back in. Over that next year, many things happened as the Israelites wandered the desert towards the land that God had promised Abraham, the place that had become known as the Promised Land. God gave them the 10 Commandments to obey.
Here they are.
Which they immediately began disobeying. They complained that they were hungry.
We're hungry.
So God gave them manna which fell from the sky. They complained they were thirsty.
We're thirsty.
So God gave them water from a rock. They got sick of manna.
We don't like manna.
So God provided quail for them to eat. And this is how it went for the year that it took to get to the Promised Land. The Israelites were disobedient and whiny, and God continued to forgive and provide until at last they arrived at the Promised Land.
Here's a land that God promised us, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Ooh, yeah, you know, Moses, I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I'm a little lactose intolerant. That's it, that's it.
I sent spies in the land to tell us what we will find there.
I'm back.
Well,
There are many different groups of people living there already,
What?
and they're huge.
What?
They're going to be dangerous enemies.
Oh, great, just great.
we never get anything we want.
I wish I were back in Egypt.
I wish I had never followed you. I wish I were dead.
Enough! God has promised us this land, and yet you
Still
complain. God has told us He will defeat our enemies for us, and yet you still complain and don't trust Him. Push Him enough!
And so God, who had led the Israelites to the Promised Land, punished them. They were forced to wander the desert for the next 40 years. None of those who saw God's wonder in Egypt ever got to see the Promised Land,
Oh, man.
including Moses.
Oh, man.
And to make a long story short,
Too late.
40 years passed. Scene 4, wandering in the desert.
Or get up at the next exit. I've got sand in my shoe.
Moses died, and God chose a new leader for the Israelites, named Joshua. Joshua was humble and led the Israelites well. At last it was time to re-enter the Promised Land. Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, and this time they were ready to trust God and do this whole thing His way.
Now listen. There are many people in this land who will try to stop us from moving in.
Didn't we make a reservation?
Pay attention! If we obey God, we'll defeat them. If we disobey God, there will be trouble. Come on.
And that's the way it worked. When they obeyed God and did things His way, nobody could stop them. Yay! But when they let sin in the picture or disobeyed God, even the wimpiest enemies beat them. And in this way, they eventually took over most of Canaan, the Promised Land. When they obeyed, they won. Yay! When they disobeyed, they lost. They won some, they lost some. And sometimes they...
We get that picture!
Hey, my goodness. All right. Where was I?
And this way way they eventually took over most of Canaan and the Promised Land.
Okay, got it. Thank you. And in this way, they eventually took over most of Canaan, the Promised Land. Scene 5, entering the Promised Land.
Or milk and honey?
I thought he said elk and bunnies.
Before his death, Joshua gave the Israelites some instructions.
I'm going to die soon.
I didn't even know he was sick.
I'm not sick, I'm old. Now, remember what God has done after I'm gone. Continue to obey him. That's what he commands of you. Now that we possess almost the entire land of Canaan, you need to go out and defeat their few remaining groups of people that live in that land.
Oh, do we have to?
Yes, you shumutzes, you do.
But why?
Because God knows what a bunch of shamneels you are. Now that we possess most of the land, there are a few remaining groups of people that still worship other gods, false gods. You are supposed to go out and defeat these people. God wants them gone so that the whole land will be devoted just to the Lord and that you won't be tempted to worship false gods.
We won't.
We promise.
Like I haven't heard that one before.
And so Joshua died. And to make a long story short,
Too late.
the Israelites ignored God. They ignored God's command to clear out all the other people living in Canaan. Scene 6, the Judges.
Or stop the ride. All this going in circles making me sick.
The time of the Judges was a tricky one for the Israelites. They refused to obey God and clear out all the other people living in Canaan. And because of this sin, more sin followed. Soon they were marrying people they shouldn't have been marrying and following false gods. They pretty much abandoned God and God allowed them to be captured and taken prisoner by their enemies.
God help us! We've been beaten and captured by our enemies!
Hey, you know, it's kind of our fault.
You mean if we had done what God told us to do and defeated the enemies, then none of this would have happened?
Yeah.
God help us! We've been beaten and captured by our enemies!
And so God sent them a leader, a judge, to lead them to victory against the enemies who had captured them.
Woohoo!
And this is how it went for 325 years. The Israelites would follow and obey God, and he would bless them and give them victory over their enemies.
Charge!
But then they'd get kind of comfy and forget about God, and God would allow them to be beaten by their enemies.
Run away!
They'd cry out to God for help,
God help us! We've been beaten and captured by our enemies!
and God would send them a new judge to free them.
Woo!
And on it went like this.
Charge! Run away! God help us! We've been beaten and captured by our enemies! Woo! Charge! Run away! God help us! We've been beaten and captured by our enemies! Woo! Charge! Run away!
Okay, that's enough. That's enough. Needless to say, they were caught in a terrible cycle of sin. During this time, a few people kept following God, no matter what. People like Boaz,
Yeah.
who was a simple rancher during this time, and Gideon,
Howdy, little doggy.
who was one of the judges God sent to lead the Israelites to victory. But as I said, the cycle of sin and disobedience continued for 325 years. You may wonder, where does it end?
Where does it end? Where does it end?
It ends with Scene 7, the Kings.
Or out of the frying pan into the fire.
The last judge during this time was a guy named Samuel. But when he retired, the Israelites started whining again.
We don't want a judge.
You want a king?
The Philistines have a king.
The Amalekites have a king.
Why can't we have a king?
We never get anything.
When they told this to Samuel, he was furious.
I'm furious. Don't you understand what it would mean to become a king? He would rule over you. He'd take your sons and your daughters and make them work in his castle and in his fields and his barns. He would take your livestock and your fields. You'd be slaves to him.
Yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. Read all this. We want a king and we want it now.
So God gave him a king. He knew this wouldn't solve everything, but he saw that they would have to learn things the hard way. During this time, there were many kings. First, King Saul. Saul was a pretty good king.